Hello, my name is Pat Fowler. I live, work, and volunteer here in Columbia. Public Access TV exists to give citizens the medium to discuss issues and events not covered by traditional media. This evening we welcome 4 citizens who also live, work, and volunteer here. Together they represent a concerned voice about the possibility of a Level 4 National Bio and Agro-Defense Facility to be built in Columbia on land provided by the university. Deliberative democracy begins with informed discussion. Our moderator today is Pete Bakutis. Thank you for joining us.
My name is Pete Bakutis. I retired here to Columbia after living for years on the West Coast. I used to come here every summer since 1980 to volunteer. Let's meet our panelists this evening. I'd like each panelist to please give your name, a short summary of your background and training, and tell us why this facility is of interest to you. Karen?
My name is Karen Onofrio, Dr. Karen Onofrio. My training is in microbiology, medical technology, pathology, and laboratory inspection. I'm currently retired and enjoy painting as an artist here. I think this is a very important issue to discuss, this laboratory. I think it has very dangerous consequences to the people and the animals here in Boone County.
Okay, Eddie.
Yeah, my name is Eddie Adelstein. I'm a physician and I have a veterinary degree. I work at the university and the VA hospital, and currently I'm the medical examiner of Boone and Callaway County. I know a lot about the process of dealing with disease. I spent a couple years in the public health service as an epidemiologist, and I feel like that I can provide some useful information to make this decision.
Thank you. And Jeff?
My name is Jeff Wendet, and I grew up in the beef cattle business all my life, and went to the university here, graduated with an animal science degree, and currently now I'm the executive vice president for the Missouri Cattlemen's Association.
And how does this issue interest the association?
Well, we feel it's very important because of its impact to the state's economy, to the livelihoods of 68,000 producers. We see a lot of cattle interest, beef interest in the state and nationally. We have a tremendous impact to the national food supply.
Thank you. Karen, would you give an overview of what is proposed for this facility and the timetable for selecting a site and building the project?
Sure. MU is proposing a donation of 100 acres of land less than a quarter-mile east of New Haven Elementary School, and this donation is to Homeland Security. On this site, Homeland Security would build a 520,000 square foot lab. That's the equivalent of about 3 super Walmarts. And they will study the most deadly diseases in the world. The name of this facility will be the National Bio and Agro Defense Facility, or NBAF in shorthand. And MU is one of 17 sites at this time being considered. Originally 29 sites applied, it's down to 17, and within the next week 3 to 5 sites should be listed as finalists. At that time there will be 15 months of environmental impact studies done, and the absolute final site chosen by October of 2008.
And when would this open, wherever it is chosen to be opened?
They're predicting 2013 or 2014 as a finish date.
Fine. Eddie, why is the current Plum Island a better choice for a facility of this sort than Columbia, Missouri?
Well, in 1952, it was noted that no dangerous organisms could be brought on continental USA. These were so dangerous that no one in their right mind would bring them here. And so it was determined that there was an island off in New York State called Plum Island, 864 acres, an isolated island with very few buildings that could serve as a site for this operation. To get to Plum Island, you had to cross 2.5 miles of water, and the wind blew out to sea. Because of the situation, it was assumed that Plum Island would be a safe place to deal with these dangerous organisms. And the fact is that Plum Island, with the facilities being 50 years old, that there's some effort to either renovate the facilities or move it. New York City, or New York State, which is full of what I think highly energized entrepreneurs, basically is not in the market for this because it's too scary. too likely that an epidemic could occur affecting 6 million people. And the senators basically, Hillary Clinton has said, we don't want it here. We want it somewhere else, although this fulfills the most safest criteria we can. On the other hand, everybody has recognized that Plum Island has had many accidents, has had many problems. Some believe it's been a source of some infectious that has left the island, but their claim to fame is that no disease organism has left the island, although they admit there have been many breaches from buildings and from other people and animals. So it seems like the feeling must be maybe we could find a place that we could fool people. Maybe rural Missouri. Maybe we could put this in rural Missouri because we couldn't tell the difference. But the fact is we can tell the difference, and the best site would be Plum Island or another place that's totally isolated where there's geological barriers. So if anything happened, you could protect the animals and the people in the area.
Karen, if I might ask, what types of organisms or diseases might this laboratory experiment on?
Well, let me tell you a little bit about what this NBAF would be. They would take essentially Plum Island Lab, which is a level 3 lab, agricultural, and they experiment on livestock animals, not small mice and guinea pig and tissue culture, but livestock animals, cattle, sheep, pigs. And they would infect them with organisms that are either at a level 3, which is currently what they work on in Plum Island, or a level 4. Now, the whole reason to call this facility a new name is that they are going to take the Plum Island status, level 3 ag, raise it up to a level 4, and they refer to this as next generation Plum Island, unique, and in the words of Homeland Security, there is no other facility equal to this facility anywhere in the world. Now, if there is no facility equal to this anywhere in the world, it seems to me that they could find a more remote location than in Columbia, Missouri.
And Karen, if I might ask, how close would this laboratory, if it located in Columbia, be to the nearest school and to the new public high school?
It would be less than a quarter mile to New Haven Elementary. It would be within 2 miles of Shepherd Boulevard Elementary and Cedar Ridge Elementary, about 2.7 miles from Rockbridge High School, 3 miles from Hickman High School, and about 4.5 miles from the new high school. Then the Catholic school that's proposed, high school, I think that's within about 2 or 2.5 miles. And as Eddie was talking, the reason New Yorkers don't want this level 4 lab on that island is that level 4 pathogens are dangerous and exotic agents. And examples of those are Ebola virus, Marburg virus, hemorrhagic viruses. They pose, and I quote, a high risk of exposure and infection to laboratory personnel, the community, and the environment. And this is a quote from the National Institutes of Health publication of Biosafety in Microbiological and Biomedical Laboratories. So they're saying in this publication that these organisms are high risk for the community and the environment, besides for the laboratory personnel themselves.
Well, Eddie, let's get right to the meat of the matter. What are the health risks, if any, from locating the laboratory where it's proposed here in Columbia?
Ideally, these laboratories are constructed so no leaks can occur. But as a matter of fact, the history of all these labs, that there have been countless breaches, countless, because there's a human element, because people leave their work because they can carry viruses on them, and because these dangerous organisms are shipped in, and often there's problems in the transportation of them. So the risks are spectacular. The risk could be to essentially affect many of the animals in the state, and could actually all these organisms apparently can mutate, and so these are organisms that can kill us, and we have no treatment for these organisms. So the risk is huge, and the gain is small.
Jeff, we mentioned that you're with the Cattlemen's Association. Share with us who belongs to the Cattlemen's Association, and why is it really interested in this laboratory?
Well, I think it's important to note that we are the voice for 68,000 beef producers in this state. We are second in cow numbers, ranking in the United States with over 2 million cows. That has a tremendous impact to the state's economy, to the livelihood of the producers that raise them. When we look at a lab like this and the potential for a leak, and in the terms of foot and mouth disease, it could be one of the most contagious diseases known to the cattle industry. It is an airborne virus, and it can have a dramatic impact on infection to the state's cattle population.
And if a leak occurred, if a breach occurred, and foot and mouth did escape from the laboratory, how might that impact the cattle industry in Missouri?
Well, it could have a dramatic impact. When we look at a breach and the area within that breach that would have to be quarantined, we're looking at its vicinity to Highway 63 and Highway 70, Interstate 70. There is a tremendous amount of cattle that are transported both on 63, even more on I-70 through the state. And besides the cattle transportation issue, it would have a dramatic impact on all transportation on those particular highways. So it would have a tremendous economy impact to the state.
And would any of these cattle have to be destroyed if there were a leak of this hoof and mouth?
Absolutely. Right now, I know there's some vaccines that are being worked on in that regard, but they're not here yet. Okay. And the only safe way is to have destruction of the animal.
Now, Jeff, has the Cattlemen's Association taken a public position, or is it in the process of doing that at this time vis-a-vis this laboratory?
Well, on June 20th, I think it's important to note that we had a full board meeting. We carefully reviewed all the documentation of this particular lab and voted unanimously to oppose it. And once we learned about what some of the impacts could be to the state and to our livelihoods, we took a very serious approach to it and decided to oppose it.
Okay. Karen, if I might ask you, what is the difference between a level 3 lab and the type of lab proposed for here, a level 4 lab?
A level 4 lab pathogen usually causes severe human or animal disease that can readily be transmitted from one individual to another directly or indirectly. There are no treatments or cures. Again, an example is Ebola, which is one of the hemorrhagic viruses. 9 out of 10 people who would be infected with Ebola would die of massive hemorrhage. So to work on a level 4 pathogen, you must be in a spacesuit with your own air supply, or you work in a biological level 3 safety cabinet. There is air pressure that must be maintained. If you're in the spacesuit, after you leave the lab, you have to go through a decontamination shower. Then you get out of your spacesuit, then you strip all the way down to bare skin, and then you shower, and then you can finally exit the laboratory. These pathogens are extremely dangerous to work with. A level 3 organism is one level below this. Example is Rift Valley fever, yellow fever. Some of the level 3 organisms, anthrax, SARS, some of them, such as yellow fever, there are some vaccines that can be given. Others, there are not vaccines. These levels are determined by the National Institutes of Health. Center for Disease Control, they categorize organisms a little bit differently as A, B, and C, and USDA talk about select agents and et cetera. So these different institutes categorize these organisms a little bit differently, but it depends on how they're studying them and what the risk is to the laboratory worker and in the community, et cetera, that determines at what level the laboratory must be for them to work on these organisms.
Okay. Eddie, as the Boone County and Callaway County medical examiner, what are your concerns, not only with this lab, but plans to try to convert some of these animal viruses into a human infecting form?
Well, originally in Plum Island, when they started out, we sort of believed that all these viruses, which mostly are from animal to man, were fairly species specific. Even so, we thought chicken viruses only got chickens. They were more economically oriented. Now we recognize that almost all these viruses can mutate to forms which can infect us. So we have no species protection anymore. And so when you have organisms, and there may be active efforts to make these organisms more virulent, because in Plum Island eventually became a germ warfare island. And once this goes into effect, the doors are closed. We'll never know what goes on in there. They'll never tell if something bad happens, which is the nature of almost all these institutions. So every unknown death that would occur in Columbia while I'm the medical examiner, deaths that we don't know exactly why, we would have to raise the scepter that maybe this is the first episode of an unknown virus. We would be scared. I would be scared to be a medical examiner under that situation. Any unexplained death would have to meet the criteria of, can we rule out that this is not the beginning of an epidemic? So life would be scary, and the perception of this may be worse than the actual accidents because already people are scared. Already people are saying, maybe this isn't a good place to live, a good place to retire, a good place to send my kids to school, and a good place to have my home. So the perception and the reality are both devastating to this community as well as the risk, which is quite real.
Jeff, we've talked a little bit about foot and mouth disease and how dangerous it is to your cattle industry. How important is that industry to the state's economy?
Well, we recognize the fact that we have over $1 billion impact to the state. As I mentioned earlier, we have over 2 million cows. We are a cow-calf state, ranking second in the nation. It would have a dramatic impact to the state's economy. We've been committed to producing a safe, wholesome, healthy product, and we want to keep that reputation as producing that. Our producers want to do the right thing, and we don't need any extra outside sources or things happening that could affect our livelihood.
Okay, now to focus a little bit more on your view and the Cattlemen Association's view, you feel that this laboratory, if I understand correctly, is a necessity. Your argument is not in this place. Now, did I say that right, or,
Yes.
or did I not focus it quite correctly?
Yes, I think most of the cattlemen in this state would agree, when they look at the facts and the figures, would agree that, yes, this is important research. It needs to take place. But why would it be located in such a metropolitan area, in such a densely populated, both human side and a densely populated cattle state, when we know there's other places, more remote places, where this could, this kind of research and important research take place. But we just think it's too important that to have it located here doesn't make sense.
Okay.
You know, the point is that dealing with these dangerous organisms the only tricks we really have is isolation and quarantine. And of course, in veterinary medicine, test and slaughter, which we don't serve the purpose in dealing with human disease. But the fact remains is that to place this laboratory in the center of the United States, where we could centrifugally watch an epidemic occur right before our eyes, really can't be appreciated as any kind of rational thought. It's really frightening that people could even suspect or could even suggest that this be proposed in this area. So, and in some way, we're a little lucky because their site they picked is so unreasonable, demonstrates such a risk to the population next to a grade school, that I'm hoping that alone would be enough to make people realize the decision makers here have not made good decisions, and we should be very careful with respecting their thought processes, because this is a very, very bad decision.
Now, you bring up quarantine, and I'm going to ask Karen, if there were a quarantine after a breach occurred, what does that mean to the people in Columbia? How would a quarantine affect the average person, and what kind of size area might be affected?
Well, it would depend on a few things. Number one, if it was an animal disease primarily, such as foot and mouth, that very rarely affects humans. However, the problem is that humans can carry it on their clothing, in their nose, on their cars. So if foot and mouth got out, that is so contagious that we would undergo quarantine. Would it be 25 miles in a radius, 10 miles? I don't know. It depends on how far they thought the virus spread. And if it came out of this facility, the quarantine would just be a radius around Columbia. So you're talking no traffic on I-70 moving, nothing on 63 moving. Everything would come to a dead stop until all the animals within that zone would be slaughtered. And we're talking about deer that run around this facility area constantly. All those deer would have to be hunted down, isn't that correct?
That's right.
Jeff?
Every cloven hoof animal would have to be destroyed.
And all of the people's pets and birds can carry the virus on their fur. And so they are transmitting that virus. So it would just really be a nightmare.
So conceivably, this could be 50 miles of I-70, 50 miles of US 63 closed down.
It could even be more than that. It all depends on how far the virus spread initially when it was first discovered. And then that would be the quarantine zone, and everything inside that quarantine zone would be slaughtered. And then decontamination stations would have to be set up for vehicles and people to move out of the quarantine zone, from what I understand. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, has a risk analysis been made of how central Missouri might be affected when a breach ultimately does occur?
As far as I know, this has not occurred.
And is there a disaster plan in place?
I have no idea. That's a question to the university officials.
One of the questions that we've been touching on, and I throw out to any of our panelists, what risks do Columbia, Central Missouri, and the state face if the lab were to be located in Columbia?
There are really two risks. One is the risk that a real incident occurs, which is quite likely because the natural history of these, that they do occur. And then we would find out whether we're really equipped to deal with those. But it's, again, the only tricks we have are quarantine, isolation, and we don't have much else. And many of these viruses are deadly. So that would be an enormous risk. There's an enormous emotional risk to people just living in an area where anyone who gets sick, everyone starts worrying. Suppose the people who work at this facility get sick. I mean, what are doctors going to do when they come to their hospital? They'll be afraid because we're dealing with organisms that there is no cure for. There's an enormous financial risk. I mean, this is being pushed pretty hard by the money people in Columbia because they just see it as an opportunity to bring in like $3.5 billion of assorted monies. So it looks like a great deal for them. But I don't think what they recognize that there'll be a dead zone, a 5-mile dead zone east of town. Property values will decrease. No businesses will go there. People are reluctant to live there. We could turn this place into a Times Beach. If we have a real incident that's documented, people would be afraid to send their kids to school here. And so I don't think this is just scary tactics. I think these are really, this is reality that it could occur. And the risk ratio benefits are so much in the favor of not doing this. There's so much in the favor of finding an isolated place where there are geological barriers that you could put a facility here that it makes no sense to put here. In fact, it's unmeasurably stupid to put a facility like this in this population in the center of the United States. It's indefensible, and it's really scary that people would actually agree to do this or even want to do this.
Because, see, you have to understand, Pete, that they can work on human pathogens, pathogens that go from animals to humans, or just animal pathogens. So say, for instance, they're working on Ebola virus, and their air system breaks down, and this is all shot up into the atmosphere and spreads all around. Well, they're not going to evacuate 100-some thousand people somewhere else who are potentially infected. They will quarantine us by force and let nature take its course because there is no treatment.
I think the other thing that's scary that, and if you review the history of almost all these level 4s and even level 3s, that when an accident occurs, you have the typical response by most government bureaucracies is not to tell, to hope that no one notices. So in Plum Island, for instance, there were many years where it was simply closed. You couldn't get on Plum Island. Nobody could get on there. Nobody could find out what was going on. So we would expect that the natural history of all these things, if there is a disaster, that we would be the last to know because that's how it works. So that's another really scary thing, and no one can safeguard that. It's the natural history of these kinds of bureaucracies not to tell.
Okay. Jeff, where should this lab be located? What kind of a place would be suitable?
Well, I think we could be looking at another island to maybe locate this on. Surely there's another location similar to Plum Island. Plum Island has served us well in the past, even with some of the breaches they've had, but it's been able to be contained. So somewhere where it'd be less populated, maybe in a more desolate area, wherever that might be, I think it requires more study.
Okay. Karen, let me ask, if someone is interested in volunteering to help your group, how would they get a hold of a person? Where would they look on the web?
There's a group, and our name is nodeathlab.org. They can email us at nodeathlab@yahoo.com. They can go on our website, nodeathlab.org, and there's a tremendous amount of material. There are links, scientific data, pretty much any kind of information they would want. They can go ahead and look on that website and write us with questions. There's a petition, online petition. If they are against this facility, they can go ahead and sign up. There are
Okay.
downloads.
Great. Jeff, anything in closing?
No, I just think it requires more thought, more careful thought and consideration where they need to put this lab, but we don't see that it needs to be located in Columbia.
Okay, Eddie, any final thoughts?
I think that the more people know about this, the less likely they'll support this. I think this was an under-the-radar plan. The university actually worked very hard to present this in a favorable way to the people in Columbia. They hired a public relations group that was not exactly fair. You know, it was kind of a push-pull campaign, like asking questions, would it be okay if we took the school down? So I think that once the public knows about it, and that's our job to tell the public, they'll see that this is not a benefit to this area, and rational, you know, thought processes should take over, and it should be moved to either an island or to a desert or where there's 2,000 acres around it that can make it relatively secure.
Okay,
And-
Karen.
The whole purpose of our group is to get this medical information out because we don't feel that it is being discussed in the community, and that's why our website has so many links. And if people do have medical questions, we welcome those at nodeathlab@yahoo.com, and we'll be happy to answer them or point them in the right direction.
Fine. I would like to thank our panelists. Jeff, thank you very much for joining us and giving a Cattlemen's Association perspective. Eddie, we want to thank you very much, your medical examiner information and knowledge, the veterinary medicine also, and Karen, thank you very much, the medical and the laboratory analysis. And we'd like to thank all of the viewers for listening to the show and for taking a look and educating themselves so they will know what's coming if this does come to town.